Just how do we ensure that we have enough food for everyone, especially when a crisis strikes? That's a question that many governments have been forced to ask in recent months. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected transport and distribution systems, and the Ukraine war has made matters worse by affecting food and fuel supply. Now, the way governments respond to crises play a big role in risks and costs for everyone in the food chain and keeping food on the table. Let's unpack this now with Professor Ruth Hall, South African Research Chair in Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape, but also known as PLAS. Prof, thank you so much for your time this evening. We do understand you're coming to us from a school function of some kind, but we do appreciate you taking up the time to speak to us. You and your colleagues always making the time, and we do appreciate it. Let's start straight off the bat now. Obviously, we have spoken to you and your colleagues, I think, quite a few times, especially during hard lockdown, where we were really seeing the effects that were being felt by our most impoverished here in South Africa as a result of the very hard lockdown that was put in place by government as it tried to come to grips with this pandemic. Now, PLAS at UWC has conducted a one-year action-orientated research project entitled The Impacts of COVID-19 Responses on the Political Economy of African Food Systems. And it seems like a fascinating study because you focused on South Africa, Ghana and Tanzania. Talk to us about the study and how you went about putting this together, because one year should give you a very, very interesting snapshot coming out of hard lockdown, but then also looking at the crises that befell the entire world right from the start of this year.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marcel. So how does one do research in the midst of a pandemic? We actually set up the study in 3 countries during the hard lockdown. We worked with universities and with civil society organizations that work with small-scale farmers, small-scale fishers, street traders across these countries. And what was very important about this study, which is somewhat different from other work that's being done about food and food supply during COVID, is that we weren't looking at the question of consumers' access to food, but we were looking at the huge number of people who make their livelihoods from producing food and trading in it. So, in the South African context, we were looking in parts of the West Coast where there's small-scale fishing communities. We were looking at farmers in Limpopo who sell their food into the fresh produce markets in Johannesburg. And in KwaZulu-Natal, we were working with small-scale farmers in the communal areas who sell into the street markets in Pietermaritzburg. So the important point here is that South Africa has this very unequal food system where throughout lockdown there was enough food available to buy for who could afford to buy it. But at the same time that food prices were rising in South Africa, many of the poor people who make their livelihoods from producing and selling food actually lost out on markets. So the important point that we were making is that it matters how unequal your food system is to start with. When you go into a crisis or shock of any kind, the question of how resilient it is partly dependent on how inclusive the food system is. And South Africa's food system is very unusually concentrated in the hands of just a few companies in many parts of the food system. And I think that the other point was that we imposed a very hard lockdown that was applied actually not evenly across society. So South Africa's response was also very different from the other countries in that large-scale and commercial food supply chains were protected, supermarkets were kept open, large factories were open, but the small-scale farmers were not allowed to operate. Bucky traders were not allowed to operate. The street traders were not allowed to operate. So effectively, we closed down one part of the food system while protecting the other. And that had enormous impacts for the livelihoods of people who normally would be selling to other poor people. So that is the important thing that I think we take out of this, is that we must learn from crises, whether it's COVID, conflict, climate change, and we must get ourselves future-proofed against future crises.
And it's an interesting point then that was brought to the fore when we were struck by the crises in the Ukraine, because that had a massive impact on global distribution chains, and that was felt in South Africa because we do have a bigger emphasis or leaning on bigger supplies. And again, our current food system has struggled as a result of it. Obviously, perhaps not as much as big powers like the United States and so on, but we have felt the pinch here, haven't we? Is that also as a result of how our food system is set up here?
Exactly. And here is the irony. South Africa is so strongly linked into global markets. We buy so many of our inputs for commercial farming, for industrial types of monoculture production, where we have large farms producing grain crops on an industrial scale, depending on imported inputs like seed and pesticide and fertilizer that are firstly denominated in US dollars, bought from the other side of the world. And so when a crisis hits, actually these very long supply chains are highly vulnerable. So while a lot of other African countries are trying to support small-scale farmers to get bigger and to connect into global markets, we're actually exposing people to more and more risk as we try to incorporate into longer supply chains. And this is precisely what the current crisis has taught us. But I think there's something else that's happened, is that what we have seen is that when a crisis hits, it doesn't hit evenly. One of the things we looked at in South Africa is we looked at, for instance, the small-scale farmers who were unable to get their food to market at the beginning of lockdown, right? Now, remember that on the one hand, government was providing food aid, sometimes food vouchers, but it had closed down the small-scale sector. So the paradox there is that, for instance, as you can see on the screen now, police were confiscating produce from street traders at the same time that the army was defending the supermarkets and making people produce orderly queues to get into supermarkets. So we had law enforcement basically closing down one part of the food system, defending the other part. And what this meant is that the effects were felt in rural areas. So the black farmers who don't have big supply chains, the big trucks don't go, they have small buckies, they weren't able to get their produce to market. So we had surpluses and food wastage in some areas while people were starving in other areas. And when government intervened in South Africa, they were buying food aid from big companies through big supermarkets. So that at the same time that food prices were rising, hunger was rising, but also the large commercial food processing companies, several of them produced record profits in the first year of COVID, at the same time that supermarkets did as well. So this means that actually the crisis was highly profitable for the big corporate food system, while others were disadvantaged.
Now, what is that saying about the definition of insanity, being that if you do the same thing over and over with the same results or something along those lines? Something's got to give here. Obviously, I'm sure your institute hopes that you can get this data under the noses of our policymakers and those in government, but you've also put together this beautiful short animation that we've been watching as we've been chatting. Do you think that the challenge is twofold: to get the data under the noses of the policymakers and the people who can make a change to this food system so that we're better prepared the next time there's a crisis, and then also to help educate just ordinary South Africans about what our food system actually looks like and what needs to change?
I think so. I mean, look, we're academics. Normally we write research reports and journal articles, but we've tried producing short policy briefs. We sometimes give presentations to policymakers. In fact, we did present to all the municipal managers because we think that local government has a key role to play here in making land available for people to trade. Next time we have a crisis, we mustn't close down the informal food sector. And in fact, even outside of times of crisis, we should not be harassing small-scale traders who are making a livelihood. Yeah. So we need to get our regulations right at a local level. But we made a short animation, and if you go to the PLAS YouTube channel, you can download it or you can watch it there. It's just 6 minutes long, and it summarizes the research from Ghana, Tanzania, and South Africa and shows what happened when you have 3 different food systems and governments responded differently. here, for instance, we see, across a lot of Africa, most of the food trade is cross-border, so there's a lot of cross-border trade, and some of that was interrupted. The difference between, say, Tanzania and South Africa is that in Tanzania, when all the exports stopped and the tourists stopped coming, there were surpluses of nutritious food, like high-value fish. But then that was sold into local markets, and people got access to cheaper, nutritious food. So in more equal kinds of food systems, when consumers lose out, producers benefit, and vice versa. But in South Africa, what was different is that the poor lost out as both producers and as consumers. So that's what it shows us. I think there's certain things that we can do better next time. Firstly, there needs to be immediate cash transfers, not only in the form of consumer cash transfers, but when we give support to producers, we need to be less prescriptive. In the case of South Africa, subsidies were given to small-scale farmers for inputs, but they were struggling access to markets, so that wasn't appropriate. Also, people need to be able to get access to markets. So we've been talking about, firstly, the state needs to be a buyer of last resort where there are surpluses. We need to be able to give people access to public procurement. So small-scale farmers are struggling to sell, for instance, into school feeding schemes. And one of the issues that we found also is that there is a gendered impact of a crisis like this. Across many of our rural areas, the people who are producing food crops in the communal areas, for instance, where a lot of black farming households are based, are women. And a lot of the people selling food cheaply, especially fresh produce on the street, are women. Now, when the informal sector gets closed down, and also when schools close and women have children coming back home, they can't actually operate. And they've lost access to those school feeding programs. There's like a double whammy of extra burden of social reproduction on women, and at the same time their access to a livelihood has been destroyed. So I think that also at this, today is Youth Day, and a lot of people are talking about the fact that we have a youth unemployment crisis around our cities. We have people who have no access to jobs, but also municipalities have open land. And I think that COVID has made people think we actually need to have access to bits of land to produce some of our own food, and well-located land for public markets. Across much of the world, the local state provides access to land, water, infrastructure, refrigeration, even for people to have public markets, so that not all of our food has to be bought through commercial supply chains.
And I think in the UK,
this is one of the key livelihoods for women.
Yeah, I think in the UK is where they have allotments, I think they call it as well, where in different communities, little families have allotments of land where that they can use to start a veggie patch and that kind of thing. I think that's correct, right?
Exactly, but also across much of Africa, and we found this in Ghana, for instance, where the women who run the markets of Ghana, these are highly organized commercial enterprises involving huge numbers of people. So what you do is you create many, many, many livelihoods, and at the same time you create a resilient food system where there are many producers, many traders, and many people selling on the streets. So you have a more integrated, localized food system that creates more livelihoods and produces more affordable food. So I think that these are some of the lessons we need to take from the crisis that we've just experienced.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Professor Ruth Hall, along with your colleague, Professor Muniba Isaacs, I think it is. It's always such an education to speak to either one of you. Thank you so much for your time, as always, and for the very, very important work that you continue to do at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, or known as PLAS, at the University of the Western Cape. Great study that they've done, and as you found, just heard us say, you can go to their YouTube channel if you want to watch their latest research in action in a short animation piece that they've put together. Great stuff there.